Very importantly, tomorrow tariffs 25% on Canada and 25% on Mexico.
President Trump confirmed his intent to impose 25% tariffs starting tomorrow on Mexican and Canadian goods.
Now, he previously postponed the tax hike against America's biggest trading partners. There are fears the tariffs could have a negative impact on the U.S. economy.
So tonight, a lot of people talking about the fallout from the newly launched tariffs on U.S. trade partners Canada, Mexico, and China.
The air in North America hasn't felt this charge since the original NAFTA renegotiations. But this time, the electricity isn't just coming from the usual lightning bolts out of Washington. Tonight, the conversation across the continent is dominated by the fallout from a seismic shift in trade policy. President Trump has officially confirmed his intent to impose 25% tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico. It's a move that many hoped would remain in the realm of social media posturing, especially after the initial postponement of these tax hikes. However, the reality of a trade war with America's two largest partners is no longer a what-if. It is the schedule for tomorrow. The fear radiating through the U.S. economy is palpable, but while the headlines focus on the tariffs, something arguably more significant is happening in the background. IT started with a ripple at the World Economic Forum in Davos, a place usually reserved for polite platitudes and expensive coffee. Canada floated a bold, almost audacious rethink of how middle powers should behave in a world where the old rules seemed to be melting away. Initially, the world mostly shrugged. It was dismissed as Canadian idealism, a bit of academic theorizing with no real teeth. But then, Mexico didn't just listen. They stepped forward, fast and in public, backing the idea without a hint of hesitation. That single moment sent a hum of tension across the continent. Markets had banked on Mexico staying locked in its traditional orbit around the United States. Analysts predicted pragmatism would lead to a quiet, subservient silence. They were wrong. To understand why Mexico moved so quickly, we have to look at the morning of January 22nd in Mexico City. President Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo stood at her regular morning conference in the National Palace. When asked about the Davos speech made by Mark Carney, she had every diplomatic reason to give a non-committal answer. Instead, she praised it as very good and perfectly aligned with the current global moment. In the world of high-stakes diplomacy, that wasn't just a compliment. It was a flare sent into the night sky. It signaled that Mexico's future calculations are no longer on autopilot and their dependence on the U.S. is no longer a given. This shift didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the result of a structural breakdown that has been years in the making. Just 2 days prior, on January 20th, the atmosphere at Davos was its usual self until Mark Carney took the stage. He didn't deliver the expected safe speech. Instead, he argued that the rules-based international order has lost its credibility. He presented middle power nations with a choice: continue to compete for the favor of a dominant, often unpredictable power, or cooperate with peers to build a new kind of resilience. While Washington dismissed this as rhetoric, Mexico City heard a lifeline. President Sheinbaum entered her term as Mexico's first woman president, but she also entered it carrying the heavy baggage of a relationship with the U.S. defined by policy whiplash. The return of Donald Trump to the presidency brought back memories of tariff threats and public insults that never truly faded. When social media posts showed American flags draped over Canadian territory, or when remarks were made calling Canada the 51st state, Mexico didn't see it as mere political theater. They saw it as a blueprint for how they might be treated next. Carney's framework offered something different: autonomy without isolation and cooperation without submission. The practicality of this shift is what makes it so potent. Mexico has learned the hard way that trade policies can be weaponized in an instant. The dismantling of NAFTA and its replacement with the USMCA, which requires renewal every 6 years, essentially baked permanent uncertainty into the region's economic DNA. Competing for approval under these conditions has become a game of diminishing returns. Meanwhile, the diplomatic groundwork for a Canada-Mexico axis was already being laid. Governor General Mary Simon's 3-day visit to Mexico City, the first by Canada's first Indigenous Governor General, was a masterclass in substance over symbolism. The focus was on sovereignty, reconciliation, and the shared experience of navigating life next to a powerful, often turbulent neighbor. If you're finding this deep dive into the shifting tectonic plates of North American diplomacy valuable, this is exactly the kind of analysis we provide regularly. To stay ahead of the curve on how these middle power alliances are reshaping global markets and policy, subscribe to our newsletter for exclusive insights delivered directly to your inbox. We break down the complex moves so you can understand the why behind the headlines. The reaction from Mexican lawmakers has been surprisingly unified. Dolores Padierna Luna, a federal deputy, described the encounter with Canadian leadership as extraordinary, emphasizing that a deeper dialogue is no longer just a nice-to-have, it's a necessity. From across the aisle, Deputy Juan Ignacio Zavala Gutierrez of the Citizens Movement Party noted that emerging forces are actively seeking alliances to manage pressure from hegemonic states like the US and China. This isn't just one political faction talking, it's a national realization. Even the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, expressed concern that the current U.S. administration seems ambivalent about the continuation of the USMCA. Unity, in their eyes, is the only survival strategy left. The logic here is as much about economics as it is about pride. Take the example of canola, a commodity that perfectly illustrates the current dysfunction. Currently, Mexico imports canola from the U.S., while Canada exports its canola to China. Both countries are vulnerable to policy shifts in Washington or Beijing that they cannot control. By simply redirecting that trade, Canada selling directly to Mexico, both nations reduce their exposure to external leverage. It's a move grounded in pure pragmatism. Mexico has been watching Canada's strategic maneuvering with China regarding electric vehicles and canola tariffs very closely. They see a country acting strategically rather than reactively, and they want in. The language being used is becoming increasingly direct. Mexican officials have criticized the territorial imagery coming out of Washington as offensive, arguing that sovereignty demands a coordinated response. The goal isn't to leave the North American orbit entirely, but to balance it. When you treat your neighbors like subordinate territories, you inadvertently give them the ultimate incentive to align with each other. As Deputy Zavala Gutierrez pointed out, negotiating alone with the United States puts you at a disadvantage. Presenting a united front alters the entire equation. This is a move from symbolism to substance. When President Sheinbaum described Simon as a very interesting woman and discussed Indigenous reconciliation, she was building a partnership based on shared values. This creates a level of trust that a standard trade agreement, which can be torn up with a tweet, simply cannot provide. The math of this new alliance is also hard to ignore. When you combine the economic power of these two middle powers, the numbers start to look very different. A $4.15 trillion economic bloc is a force that demands respect. It's a scale that forces any administration that views trade as a zero-sum game to rethink its strategy. As we head into the USMCA renegotiations in 2026, Ottawa and Mexico City are no longer preparing their notes in separate rooms. They are forming a shared framework with aligned demands. The February trade mission will be the first real test of this vision. If we see new bilateral agreements that bypass American intermediation in sectors like energy, agriculture, and technology, we will know that the third path is fully operational. If Mexico begins to swap U.S. canola for Canadian supply, the shift has begun. Every insult or tariff threat from Washington only serves to accelerate the very diversification it seeks to prevent. It turns out that dependence erodes leverage, but partnership restores it. Historians looking back at the power dynamics of the 2020s will likely point to this narrow window in early 2026 as a turning point. It's the moment the assumption that Washington is the singular axis of North America began to fade. The shift didn't arrive with a grand declaration of war or a dramatic exit from a treaty. Instead, it unfolded through press conferences, legislative comments, and carefully timed trade missions. Two middle powers simply looked at the board and realized that cooperation offered a more stable future than a desperate competition for the approval of a volatile neighbor. What once seemed permanent is now flexible, and the renegotiation of power is happening in real time. Would you like me to analyze how these specific tariff levels might impact the consumer price index for electronics and automotive parts in the U.S. market specifically?